Hello and welcome to another episode of History with Andy Akright. I'm Andy Akright. Today we're going to be talking about the Miller home in Lawrence, Kansas. Now the Miller home is significant because William Quantrill, raided the town of Lawrence with 400 men in the year 1863, killing between 150 and 200 men and boys and burning and destroying much of the town. Now, Quantrill was pro-slavery, and Lawrence was a bastion of anti-slavery. However, the Miller house was not touched. So today we are treated to a special tour from former Kansas professor Dennis Dailey, who will show us the Miller house. Welcome. Mr. Dennis Dailey, and Mr. Dennis Dailey lives in a very special place in Lawrence, and I'll let him take over.
Well, this is the Robert Miller home. Robert Miller came from South Carolina and ultimately came here in 1858 after spending a couple of years in Illinois. He migrated from Ireland. He was a member of the Associated Presbyterian Church and in South Carolina, and that was a church that did not allow its members to hold slaves. And so for a while he was fine, but by the time the mid-1800s came along, that was not a very good stance for him to take, and so it was a very threatening environment for him. Ultimately, his son, Josiah Miller, who would come here in 1854, encouraged his parents to come to Lawrence. I've written an article in the Kansas Journal of History, Kansas Journal of History, on that, all of those letters. So he got here in 1858. His son had bought some land. He was a very successful farmer. What's left of this property right now is 5 acres. This house, the original house is just that front part, and then in 1863 they built this L off to the back that became the kitchen.
In 1863?
In 1863 that was built. This was built in 1858. It was one of the oldest houses in Lawrence, maybe the oldest house in Lawrence. See, that's the second barn. That was built in 1910. Everything that's on the National Register of Historic Homes. That outhouse is 1858. There's a big silo out in back, and there's another building out there that was a granary. And in 1858, there was not a tree in sight. This was all prairie. And Lawrence was 2 miles that way, downtown Lawrence, which is only about three blocks in 1858. Another little town right over there called Franklin was a pro-slavery community. And this property was almost right in between. And this is on the register for two reasons. One is Quantrill stopped here in 1863, August of 1863, watered his horses, visited with the family, visited with a daughter of the family. One of his men had come to Lawrence a couple weeks before and had taken a meal and stayed here for just one night. But he rode in on the Oregon Trail, which ran right in front of this house. And we've seen evidence of the trail back there. Obviously, if it was wet, they'd go wherever it was dry. So,
Sure, the swales and everything.
He came in with 400 men, visited here, went across the road over there to Reverend Snyder's house. Reverend Snyder was out in his pasture milking a cow, and two of his men peeled off and shot him dead. He was the first He was the first victim of the raid. But I think they had picked him out. He had also been a minister a chaplain to one of the Civil War units. So he was picked. We think he was picked. And they went in, destroyed Lawrence, and left.
So this house here, Quantrill came in with 400 people. He killed 200 or more.
They killed at least two. They killed men and boys somewhere around 200.
And because one of his men stayed here and they treated him well, and then because they had a conversation with the daughter,
that's recorded. Her brother recorded a remembrance of that. It's in the museum.
And so that's why they just passed over this house.
Yeah, the only way that you could possibly explain why they would not, because they killed everybody in sight.
Yeah.
Why they would not harm these people and burn their original barn down and burn their house down is because of that. That's the hypothesis. Nobody knows for sure. But Quantrill had been here a couple of years before. He was a teacher and a scoundrel. Yes. He was a psychopath as far as I'm concerned. And I think the Millers knew him, or he knew them, just because of that encounter early, sometime. So there were several situations in which during the raid he told his men not to assault certain people who he remembered and knew who had treated him well, like Mr. Stone, who had a hotel. He survived because of that. So the hypothesis is that personal stuff probably was what saved them.
That's wild.
And then this place is also on the register because the Miller family was a part of the Underground Railroad, and this is an Underground Railroad site.
Yes.
And the same road that Quantrill came in 5 or 6 years earlier, slaves came up that road. It was called the Franklin Road or the Oregon Trail. And they would be sequestered here in an old building there's one photograph of it that I have of a smokehouse, and that's where slaves were held for a day or two, then usually loaded in a wagon and taken off to Topeka and then often up Canada and Iowa.
So there was kind of a stop-off point where they get a meal and that, and then rest a day, and then get in the wagon and go to Topeka. Oh, that's awesome.
The slave traffic through Lawrence wasn't huge. It was probably several hundred, and there probably weren't more than several dozen who had come through this property. But there's a fairly strong line of evidence that identifies this as a Underground Railroad site, and it's on the register for that reason, along with the Quantrill raid.
Cool. Would you mind showing me the other buildings?
Sure. The outhouse, we have kids come here often, students. They love this outhouse. There are also a couple of hand-dug wells, one of which is right next to the house, which is about 27 feet deep.
Is that the red pump?
Yeah, and the kids just, they love that. They love it. It's now, I use it as a shop, but it was a granary. And we have photographs of the Millers. They raised cattle, so we have photographs of their cattle. And we have two photographs of the area back there where they're doing thrashing with a steam engine, huge thrash machine, great big straw, where they thrash grain back there. I think at one point there was probably 180 acres that was in this area that was their farm. So he was a very successful farmer, and they were very prosperous. They sold their land in South Carolina and came here with some substance. They weren't poor. They weren't poverty-ridden by any means.
No, the silo, I didn't think that was original. I thought that was more modern.
That's a tile silo that was probably built in the 1880s, 1890s, right in there. It's before this barn. This barn was 1910.
And you said the second barn? Is that what you...
Yeah, this is the second barn. When you go in the barn, in that barn, in the internal structure, there's not a nail. It's all put together with huge pieces of wood and pegs and dowels and that sort of thing. It's a fascinating architecture.
And the wall over here.
That's another building that was taken down. Some of the rubble of which is right there in that pile.
Yeah.
That was probably a machine shed. May have been I don't know what we don't know what it was. All we know is that there was a stone foundation, and I've kept the grass off it so that people can see the foundation.
Yeah.
And right now, what's left is a little over 5 acres.
So did you know all the history?
No. I came here in 1969 as a member of the faculty, and we lived on the other side of town. We were driving around and saw a little sign out on the front lawn about this big that said "for sale." And my partner is from the country. She was born and raised on a farm. I come from a small town in Minnesota. And we saw this place and said, we've been by it before. So we swung in, went inside. Real estate person happened to be here visiting with Mrs. Eller, who was the previous owner, and visited with her for a little bit, actually for quite a long time, and bought it that day. We realized at the time it wasn't us selecting a home, it was her selecting who she wanted to be the next owners of this home.
Yeah.
It was a very interesting experience.
For sure.
A fascinating experience. There's only 3 names on the deed for this property. The Millers lived here for 100 years. The Ellers lived here for about 25 years, and we've lived here for about 35 years.
Wow. So you feel like a caretaker of history?
Oh yeah, no doubt about it. I've become very, I was always interested in history, but I know the history of this and real well now. The great-granddaughter of Robert Miller lives in Des Moines. And back early, she came down, and they were very familiar with this place. Ultimately, she sent me photo albums and other materials related to the Millers that I now have and can tell a good story with. It's wonderful to have all those artifacts.
Oh yeah.
It's wonderful. Original photographs that don't exist anyplace else. So we live in history and we like to tell the story.
Well, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Mr. Dennis Dailey.
Right.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you very much for viewing this episode, and thank you very much to former Kansas professor Dennis Dailey. This has been another episode of History with Andy Akright. I'm Andy Akright, and I'll catch you next time.